Today we will talk about the what is substantive variation and what is meristic variation. Substantive variation is that variation which influence the external appearance of an organism. So the variation which affects the external appearance of an organism is known as substantive variation. Substantive variation affects the external appearance of an organism. It affects the external appearance of an organism. Substantive variation, it can affect the size. Substantive variation, it affects the size, weight, height, color of an organism. Examples of substantive variation are, for example, height in humans, color in humans, or we can skin color in humans, or eye color, weight, shape of nose, length of fingers. These are substantive variation. So substantive variation influences the external appearance of an organism. Substantive variation affects the size of an organism, weight of an organism, height of an organism, color of an organism. Height in humans, skin color, eye color, weight, shape of nose, length of fingers, hornless cattle. This milk yield in cows. Egg yield. These are examples of what substantive variation. Egg yield. These are examples of substantive variation. Then we have got substantive variation is that type of variation which influences the external appearance of an organism. This substantive variation, it affects the size of an organism, height of an organism, weight of an organism, color of an organism. For example, height in humans, substantive variation. Weight in human, substantive variation. Eye color, skin color, or hornless cattle, example of substantive variation. Milk yield in cows, or egg yield. These are examples of substantive variation. Then we have got this meristic variation. Meristic variation is that type of variation which affects the external, which affects the number of parts of the organism. So we can say that meristic variation is that type of variation which affects the number of parts of an organism. So the meristic variation is that type of variation which affects the number of parts of an organism. For example, meristic variation is that type of variation which affects the number of parts of an organism. For example, polydactyly. Generally, there are 5 digits, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. But in some humans, there are 6 digits. So polydactyly is an example of meristic variation because it affects the number of parts of an organism. For example, polydactyly, number of digits in humans. That is, polydactyly is 6 digits in humans. So polydactyly is 6 or more digits in humans. Same number of, another is number of tentacles in hydra. This is also an example of meristic variation. Number of tentacles in hydra, tentacles in hydra, also an example of meristic variation. Number of, another is number of segments in earthworms. It is also an example of meristic variation. Number of segments in earthworms. Number of segments in earthworms is also an example of meristic variation. So meristic variation affects the number of parts of an organism, and substantive variation, it affects the external appearance of an organism. It affects the size, weight, and color of an organism. Thanks.